All right. Hello, Matt. How you doing?
I'm good. How are you? Thanks for having
I'm
me.
yeah, doing good. Let's dig right into this. I'm curious about the name of the book and how that came about. If we could start with that.
Yeah, so the book's basically mainly based on journalism I did while I was at the Financial Times in the UK and in Washington and New York as well. And when I was reporting there, I kind of came to an understanding of how the world works and how the US empire works, which I still have. But it basically uh, the top line of that is that the US empire, the infrastructure empire, the military, the intelligence agencies, all of that is about projecting American corporate power and about protecting the interests of the 1%. So, and there's so the title, "The Racket," comes from a speech by General Smedley Butler, which basically outlined that. General Smedley Butler was died the most decorated Marine in U.S. history in the early 20th century, but he signed up to the Marines in 1898 during the Spanish-American War, which is when a lot of historians put the start of the American Empire as the time when it happened. I mean, that was the Americans won that war, and they took on a host of imperial possessions that Spain held, like Guam, Puerto Rico, and others. And General Butler fought in that war. He then fought through in all the interventions in Central America, China during the early 20th century. But he had an awakening later in life when he left the military and started understanding what he was in those places for. And it wasn't what he'd been told, which is that you're defending American freedom, you're defending American security, all that kind of stuff. And in this speech, he says, uh, uh, basically, what he says, I wasn't in Honduras for US national security reasons. I was in there for the interests of Brown Brothers Bank. And he says, I was a racketeer, a high class muscle man for big business. And he compared himself to Al Capone. He said Al Capone could work in 4 districts. I worked on 4 continents. So this is the US military he's talking about. So, and that's why I called the book The Racket, because I think that speech, which was eventually made into a book called War is a Racket, really is truthful and goes to the heart of the matter. That this empire is a rapacious and maximalist empire that is all about pumping up the bottom line of the 1% in America. Because the other thing about the American empire is when politicians have to defend it, and it's never talked about as an empire, obviously within corporate media, even in the United States, of course, but even in allies media, we're all fed the lies. But when they do have to defend it, they say, well, this is America gets lots of benefits from this infrastructure that we have overseas, these bases, blah 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 blah. But the other facet of this is this racket that Smedley Butler wrote about and that my book's about. The benefits of empire don't go back to the American people at all. That they ingratiate and enrich a very very small selection set part of American society, which is the 1%, and actually the 0.1% often. So that's where the title comes from. I think that my experience reporting in places like Haiti, in Bolivia, in Egypt and Turkey, all these different places really kind of brought this home. Like Haiti's a very good example, and the book opens in Haiti, because Haiti is kind of the emblematic example of a country that's been destroyed by American imperialism. Unfortunately, it's very, very close to America geographically. And it's been punished ever since 1804, when it became the first free black republic in the so-called New World, when there was a slave revolt and they kicked out the French. An amazing historic moment, but they've been made to pay for that ever since. They've been punished first by the French, and then when the Americans took over the imperial role, they've never been allowed to develop as an independent country. There was a tiny bit of hope in the early 90s when John Bertrand Aristide was elected in 91, first democratically elected president in Haiti's history. And he wasn't a super radical guy. He was a liberation priest. He was a social democrat, but he was propelled into power by a huge popular movement. His party was called Lavalas, the Flood. But what you see is the Americans, again, well, they took him out twice. The later stage was in 2004 by George W. Bush, when he was literally put on a plane by the American ambassador and flown to the Central African Republic where he was until quite recently, and Lavalas's party still banned in Haiti. And why did they do that? Because the Americans had a very, very set image for what they wanted Haiti to be. And that chapter goes into my experience being sent there by the Financial Times after the earthquake in 2010. So I went there the following year to report on the so-called reconstruction. And it was just, it was amazing to see on the ground what Naomi Klein talks about in her book, The Shock Doctrine. You know, this idea that the Americans and the other sort of imperial powers will use some moment of tragedy to when there's a completely destabilized society and there's no possible resistance can be put up, to impose a very, very extreme form of neoliberal economics on a country. Now, Haiti was basically destroyed in that earthquake. It's kind of incomprehensible what happened. You know, 300,000 people died instantly. When I arrived, the presidential palace was collapsed. Pretty much every government ministry, the whole of Port-au-Prince, the city I was in, the capital, was living in tents. And I was taken around by the World Bank and the IMF, interviewed the US ambassador, and what they were showing me was the program they'd had for Haiti for many, many years, but not been able to do. Firstly, because of Aristide, but secondly, because they hadn't, even the leaders they'd managed to get in had not done what they wanted to do. And a lot of the information I got about the real American plans for Haiti was from the WikiLeaks cables. So there's a passage that I found. I read every WikiLeaks cable from Port-au-Prince to Washington from sort of probably 2004 to 2010. And there was a whole section where there was this one businessman called Simeus who he literally, in a conversation with the American ambassador, and obviously they didn't think this was ever going to get revealed, but he said, "Don't worry, look, I'll run Haiti for you like a business." That's a quote. And he says, and then the ambassador said, "Actually, I think he's right. I think he wants to bring the Chicago boys to Haiti." Now, the Chicago boys obviously are the neoliberal economists who followers of Milton Friedman, who blew up Chile's society and economy after Pinochet was installed. And that was kind of what I was seeing in Haiti. You know, they were basically their model that they wanted was a sweatshop model. They wanted to take advantage of the fact that Haiti has basically zero regulations because they've never been allowed to have a strong minimum wage and all that kind of stuff, and take advantage of that and just build these little special economic zones, they're called, little zones where they're walled off from the rest of society. You get these workers to come in to work for pittance, and you can attract foreign investment to come and build their products because and make their clothes because they can get these workers for really, really cheap. And it's a disastrous model because first of all, it only develops these little small little areas in the country, and then the society at large is destroyed. Secondly, it completely ignores what Haiti has done for hundreds of years, which is subsistence and farming. You know, and what they could have done. There was a model that some people within Haiti were promoting, which is saying, look, get rid of all the corporate-owned land, and get rid of all the land that's owned by a few landowners, and give it out to the people so they can produce their own products for themselves, subsistence farming. But that's completely against the ideology that these people promote, because you don't exist for these people if you're not creating something for the market. And unfortunately, the tragedy of Haiti continues, and that is because of the United States. You know, even their agricultural industries were destroyed in the 1990s when Clinton dumped a whole load of cheap US rice, and that had a catastrophic effect on agriculture in Haiti. So I think that's a very clear example of how the United States, firstly, do not want independent and do not allow independent governments. Secondly, how a way of being and a way of developing your society is very, very possible. It's not that this is kind of an elixir that is hard to achieve. The United States has to work. Sorry, I'll finish with the United States works very, very, very hard to make sure another world, a more just world, a more equal world, does not take place, and that's what they did in Haiti.
Yeah, and I'll just for the viewers' sake, Matt, you answered about 3 of the questions I had on key, so I just want to say thank you. You know, I'm just barely tapping into your book. I'm about halfway through, and everything that you said is illustrated within the first half of the book. Like how you say it starts off with Haiti, and you speak to some of the individuals on the ground. And they kind of have like a different perception of what's going on. You know, in most cases, you would think, you know, people seeing, you know, rubble, a palace being collapsed. In irony, it felt, you know, more or less like a new way forward. Is that if corporate and, you know, investments don't reach, you know, this island, then our people have a chance to rebuild in a way that puts them first, and not corporations. And that's I wasn't aware that you had another book, so I'm kind of curious as to as to if this is if they align. I would assume that they do. What I heard what you were saying is that these people could live equally if there wasn't colonialism. And colonialism plays a huge factor, especially today. And I think your book highlights a lot of what we're seeing right now, as far as the U.S. Imperialist mode, the Western imperialist mode. We have Trump. I just, if we can get into him alluding to, wanting to take over Greenland. And it's not because Greenland's people are asking him to, the indigenous population there. It's because they have natural resources that corporations need and want. If you could, just kind of elaborate on how what we're seeing right now is not the start of a manifest destiny. It's the continuation of a manifest destiny.
Yeah, well, part of the reason Trump's so hated by the liberal media and the democratic establishment is because he's more honest about how the United States works and has worked. Unfortunately, obviously, Trump is a monster, but he says stuff that he doesn't apply all the convenient ideology that they do to American power. And I mean, the empire that they've run, basically the liberal elite, for 100 years or more, is one that is they're allowed to propagandize the public that an empire doesn't exist. You're not allowed to use the term because it's not the same as the British Empire. It's not like they have formal colonies, although they do have a few, but that's not the way they do it. What they do is they had this open door, what's called an open door empire, which is like you have client states that basically open their economies up to be completely exploited by the United States and its corporations. If you stop allowing that, then we'll come in and subvert your government either through the intelligence agencies first, but if that doesn't work, then we'll take we'll bring in the military as well. And you see that again and again and again. So with Trump now saying he wants to annex places like Greenland, that is a bit of a departure, but it's not. It's maybe a different, a more extreme form of imperialism, but it's still imperialism that America has been practicing for a long, long time. The basic bottom line of what the American empire hates is independence. Number one, independence. They do not want a government that actually responds to its people and responds to the needs of its people. They want a government that responds to the needs of Washington. And number two, that government has to use the resources of that country to benefit the international market, to benefit corporations, not to benefit their people. And look, a very good example, and there's also a part of the book on this, is Venezuela, which is should be one of the richest countries in the world. It's got the second highest proven oil reserves in the world, and was basically just an American client for decades and generations. And then Hugo Chavez was elected in 1998, and he started transforming the society and using that oil wealth for social programs and education and all this kind of stuff. And what happened? 2002, there was a US-backed coup, which briefly deposed him, and he was taken to an island, actually, and had a gun put to his head, but they didn't kill him. And actually, the people from the barrios, the poor areas of Caracas, swarmed the presidential palace, and they were forced to put him back. That is how it works. Usually they succeed. That's like they did it with Allende, they did it with Aristide in 2004, but the Venezuela managed to survive. But actually Hugo Chavez said around that time he was being interviewed by some journalist, and he was asked, "Why do you hate America?" And he said, "I don't hate America. I've got nothing against America, but if you want to do what I'm doing, i.e., use the resources of my country to benefit the poor people who actually sit on top of those deposits, it's impossible not to go up against the American empire. One leads to the other. You can't avoid it. So you have to you have to be an enemy of Washington. He didn't want to be an enemy of Washington, and that's very true. And going up to now, you see there was a coup against Evo Morales in Bolivia in 2019, the first indigenous president of Bolivia, who similarly, like Chavez, reformed the society, which had basically been dominated by the imperial powers since the Spanish came, and he was taken out. But again, this is another interesting dynamic that we're seeing. The US empire is not as successful as it once was. You know, like the CIA took out Evo Morales in 2019, installed she was a dictator because she wasn't elected. And then there was 2 massacres as well that happened soon after she took over of indigenous people. But they came back the next year. Evo Morales and his party came back. He did a tour of the country, and there was another election, and they won the election again, and they're now in power. Luis Arce, his former economy minister, is now in power. So there is hope in all that. Like, especially most of it's in Latin America, to be honest. But the point is, we have to understand that if you want a more equal world, if you want a world where people are benefiting from their resources, you have to go up against the United States. You have to kick out the Drug Enforcement Administration. You have to kick out the CIA. You have to kick out US aid, because none of those institutions are in your country to help you, which is what they say. They're not there for aid. They're not there to aid the poor. They're not there to get rid of drug production. What they're there for is to enforce US control and to make sure you will never be an independent country. I mean, the emblematic example of a successful defiance of the US empire in the Western Hemisphere is Cuba. You know, Cuba was again, I mentioned the Spanish-American War. It was a Spanish colony up till 1898. There was a Revolutionary War, what's called in State Department the Spanish War of Independence, but actually what it was it's just the United States replacing them. And they explicitly said, we're not going to annex you as a formal colony like Puerto Rico, but we will. You have to pass they passed this thing called the Platt Amendment in Congress, and Platt Amendment basically said Cuba has to get permission from the United States to take on a certain amount of debt to sign treaties. It basically just made it a client state that couldn't move without, and then that passed. And they said, and that also was when part of that was when they got Guantanamo Bay, which they still have, which is they should have no right to as well. And that continued up to 1959 when the Cuban Revolution happened, and all of that was dismantled, and Castro nationalized everything basically, and within a couple of years they'd wiped out illiteracy. Amazing gains, and the Cuban Revolutionary, the gains they made were amazing. Obviously there's the problems now in terms of the economy, and there's quite a lot of suffering there, but that's what goes to my point, is that you can do this stuff very, very easily. They could in the United States internally, even, you know, this is the country in history. If they actually put some of that money, like instead of putting $1 trillion every year into the Pentagon, if they put some of that into education and infrastructure, you could have an actually functioning society. China is another example. When they since 1980, they've done the biggest poverty reduction program in human history. They've
Over
got
800
million people. Extreme poverty is gone, and that's not. And China's is not a industrial, like, it's not a country on the same level as the United States. So these things are very, very possible. And this is one of the other facets of the propaganda system. Is it's set up to restrict our imagination, and it's very, very powerful if you restrict it. This idea that it can't be different, that we can't do that because
it's what Chomsky would classify as manufactured consent,
exactly,
of the population. Michael Parenti has another one as well. My co-host on one of the shows that I do always alludes to Michael Parenti as well. In regards to this, I'm drawing a blank, but yes, it's manufactured consent.
Yeah, well, and he also, Parenti said, it's not that Africa or other places are underdeveloped. They've been underdeveloped. That by
Walter Rodney goes into the,
yeah,
you know, how.
Yeah, so you mentioned the previous book we did, but that was about corporations and the infrastructure of control they'd created, and that was a lot of that was inspired by Walter Rodney's book as well. Like there's a long lineage of this kind of analysis, and basically the heart of it is that the big lie we were sold after the Second World War is that empire ended. And we had this nice sort of new liberal world order where America was kind of the world policeman, but did it in a neutral way and not for its own interest. It was just to uphold this. It's complete rubbish. That the same dynamics continued, but they were dressed up and repackaged to convince people that we don't have imperial powers. So it's quite beautiful in terms of its effectiveness in terms of the propaganda, because it's so many people believe this, and you can't really work in the mainstream media without thinking it. And in fact, that just to go back to Haiti to finish, one of the amazing things about that was how hard even someone like me, who my politics and my awareness of how the world worked was pretty much the same as it is now as when I was in EFT, but you feel the pressure to absorb this way of thinking because you're getting taken around by the richest institutions in the world, by these very they know all their stuff, their representatives, and they're telling you, look, this is great. And you come from this devastation, you arrive at this special economic zone, and it's got like air-conditioned offices, paved roads, trade unions, apparently, although most of them are just co-opted by the corporations. But what it does is give you a very seductive picture of this system, and it's very, very, very hard to go up against it when you're on the inside. In fact, impossible. I think I had to leave, but no one spends 40 years banging their head against the wall thinking I'm going to fight the system from within. The system basically subsumes you and absorbs you, unfortunately. But luckily now we've got alternative media, so we can get truths outside of the legacy institutions, which are basically just arms of this whole system.
Yeah, and now I'm very curious to get your other book, because Walter Rodney is someone who I've subscribed to. I classify myself through methodology as a decolonial Marxist through his lens, and understand that, you know, even through Kwame Nkrumah, again, these are all African leaders. These are all individuals that kind of, you know, took from the methods of, you know, Marx and Lenin and, you know, anarcho-syndicalism and whatnot. In some cases, some people did. And ratified it to, you know, the notion that, you know, communism didn't come from Marx and Lenin. It's a universal thought. And so, you know, to know that you have another book on that, I'm very curious. I want to get into, because you bring up, you know, like in South America, there is, you know, resistance to imperialism. And we're seeing right now in Africa, the Sahel alliance that is resisting what would be classified as Franco-colonialism or Franco-imperialism. Could you speak to that, and how, you know, this is not an everyday occurrence? This is essentially, you know, a once in a lifetime moment where we have a multitude of micro resistance that could, you know, fester into, you know, hopefully, you know, the toppling of the US dollar, because, you know, for those that aren't aware, the BRICS makes up 54% of the population now, as far as for countries. And so we are seeing as of late, you know, the rise of BRICS and the decline of the US dollar. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, well, and it is very exciting what's happening in North Africa, but they're going to come up against the full force of the imperial powers eventually. And an interesting example of that is Gaddafi in Libya, who was a dictator, but actually, they when the uprising happened in 2011 and the NATO intervention, you know, they destroyed the society. You know, there's like slave markets there now, and the central government doesn't have control of it, and it had a healthcare system and an educational system that was free for the whole population, and that's just destroyed. And who benefited? Well, I've done some work on that. And if you look at who got the oil contracts from Libya now, it's all Western companies. So it's exciting, but I don't know. I have I try not to give false hope because I want to be hopeful, but they're so powerful, these forces. You know, like the famous example is Lumumba in the
Yes.
Congo. That is one of the most important moments in the 20th century. You know, this was the first democratically elected leader of Congo ever, and he was a noble man who had the interests of his country at heart. CIA-backed assassination of him, and Congo's been a disaster since. So I just hope that the new leaders that are coming up have some strategy for getting around it. I mean, I think a big hope is the rise of China and the rise of a multipolar world, because in Africa and Latin America, if you go to those places, which I have, like, and you talk to people in government and stuff, like, they say that they now have a different pole to organize around, and that gives you an enormous amount of power. Like, the only reason the Cuban Revolution survived was they had the Soviet Union, the infrastructure of the Soviet Union could be deployed to support that when it came under imperial attack. And it's the same now in Africa with the Chinese and the Russians to a degree. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to agree with everything the Russians or the Chinese do. I'm not talking about them as in terms of their domestic policies or even their foreign policy. I'm just saying, in a multipolar world, it gives more space for independent movements or leaders who want to operate outside of the imperial powers, more space to move, because you can play them off against each other. You can organize around a different pole, and you have choices. After the end of the Second World War, after the end of the Cold War was a pretty bleak time for the left, you know, globally, because the Soviet Union had collapsed, and there was just rampant US capitalism. Effectively, there was the Zapatistas in 1994, but apart from that, it was pretty bleak. But I think that there's more and more left governments are surviving because they can organize around different powers. Like, for example, I mean, Bolivia is a good example. China, I don't think they'd come back or manage to survive without China. Same with Venezuela. You know, under Trump's first presidency, he appointed Elliot Abrams, his point man on Venezuela, and within 6 months, Juan Guaido and Leopoldo Lopez were literally doing an armed uprising on the streets of Caracas.
You're alluding to the fake president, yes.
Yeah. But they didn't win. They didn't win, and that was partly because they had the Russians and the Chinese there to kind of, when you're trying to fight of imperial power, like the might of the United States, you need significant infrastructure to be able to do that. So I hope that that happens in Latin America. I hope it happens in Africa too. To be honest with you, I think the left, and I include myself in this, we don't talk enough about Africa, because my focus has always long been on Latin America, partly because of the Spanish, because I can speak Spanish, but also because there's been such a liberation leaders, so many getting into power. But Africa, there's quite a lot of exciting stuff that's happening that we don't take enough notice of, and we should. So I am hopeful. I mean, unfortunately, South Africa, which is so important in Africa, is the ANC has not done what it should have done since the end of apartheid. We went there for our previous book to report on the corporations, and you know, the ANC is very, very corrupt, and it never nationalized the mines. That was one of the big mistakes they made. Well, not even a mistake. That was the sort of crime, really. You know, like in the Freedom Charter that they based their struggle against apartheid on, that nationalizing the mines was like a commitment, and they never did it. And all that wealth is still owned by imperial powers and imperial corporations. And Mandela, obviously, just a legendary hero. But he's in terms of the economic policies that he put into place when he got in, they weren't what they needed to be. Now, some people would say, well, it was such a dodgy time, you had to give something back, but they gave too much. And in fact, some people even say that the white elite agreed to end apartheid because basically they ended it on paper, but they retained all their power behind the scenes, economic power, which I think probably is quite true. They creamed off a new elite amongst the black population. In fact, in South Africa, they call black diamonds a new. But if South Africa could get like it's such an important country, it just filters out from there. If they could get some liberation leader there, I don't know if you've heard of Julius Malema.
Yes, I was gonna say, what are your thoughts on the EFF? Because Julius is actually someone who is on that belt of resistance right now. That, like how you said, not a lot of, I could just say Western mainstream media, because there is something that I want a little bit later to talk about in regards to there are, I won't put you in the category because I have not ever heard you say anything about this, but kind of like a mix of slandering of the lower ranking journalists here in that I'm indigenous to these territories first and foremost, and so my fight is always against the Western media, and to hear some individuals abroad, across the pond, so to say, kind of take a jab, and excuse my French, but clusterfuck us, together, in with mainstream media is like, it's like kind of like the ultimate low, because there's just been talks of, we don't talk about Palestine enough around in the West, and I would say Western media doesn't talk about that, but indigenous media, decolonial media, definitely does. But alluding to what you were talking about in reference to to the EFF, like, what are your thoughts on them? Because they take a lot from Winnie Mandela, I would have to say, which was the wife of Nelson Mandela, who was a lot more outspoken. If you have read up on her, and kind of alluded to the same things that you talked about, is that she was elaborating in private conversations, especially with her husband. I kind of feel like you're giving them a fair, you're giving them a pass, essentially, and then at the same time rewarding them with that pass. And those are my words, not hers. But like, what would you say, just one to the EFF, and then about that?
Well, the EFF, like, it's hard to know because I read stuff and it's so critical of them. And to be honest with you, I'm not. And my next point was going to be, but of course it is, because if you're coming up with policies like they come up with, this is another facet of the system. It demonizes opponents, so they instantly become the target of the liberal media. They find corruption scandals. They present them as these completely thugs, blah blah blah. So that's the stuff I read. So I don't know enough, but I'm sure if I looked into it, you'd see that this is a demonization campaign. But what I do know is, when I went to South Africa for the Financial Times, I went to what they had every year. They had this thing called the Mining Indaba in Johannesburg. Oh no, it's in Cape Town. Yes, in Cape Town. And when I went, the ANC mining minister came. It's honestly disgusting.
It's grotesque, yeah.
Well, I was going inside, and you have all these rich white guys. One actually said was explicitly racist to me, and he thought that I would be okay with that, which obviously I wasn't, but it gives you a sign of how these people think and how it works in these circles. But it's all rich white CEOs of these mining companies, walking around, having nice canapes, talking, and then the ANC mining minister comes in and says, "Don't worry, we're not going to nationalize the mines. That's madness. We don't like." I remember watching it and just thinking, "Flipping out, this is not right." And when I was doing that, Julius Malema was making statements saying we should nationalize the mines. So in my mind, he's 100% right, and he's taking the line that the ANC should be taking, and the ANC promised when they were in their liberation struggle. So on those grounds, like, the EFF would be at least they're going to the heart of the matter, because this is what we need to talk about: nationalizations. We need to take indigenous people need to take control of their resources. That is what they're not allowed to do by the system, and that is what would change the game, because and that's why the developing world, what's so-called developing world, or the global south, is poor. It's not a coincidence. It's not some mistake. It's not the system not working as it should. That is the system working as it should. Ever like Latin America, 500 years ago, the Spanish went, and literally ever since that point, they've been siphoning all the resources out of that country to Europe initially, and then to other places, and none of it has developed. The countries themselves, like Bolivia, they got this thing called the Cerro Rico, where like hundreds of thousands of indigenous people died mining it, but it's like one of the most mineral rich mountains. If you go to Bolivia, it's one of the poorest countries. At one point, it was the poorest country in South America. It's disgraceful, but this is because the whole of the resource base has been controlled by external power, and that external power has huge amounts of ideology which it uses to justify being in that. Number one, they say, well, you need the investment and the expertise. You don't have the expertise to do it yourself. Number two, they install governments which have tax regimes which are basically just like you can have a couple of % for the state and you have the rest for the corporation. Number three, even the taxes that are paid, you have very high paid accountants working for Deloitte and other places, and then you have the government which has been completely decapitated anyway, and all the resources taken out of it. Their tax revenue service is probably like 10 people in a room. They can't. That's a massive imbalance of power, which means that these corporations, basically, what it means is they can filter out this wealth without any of it staying in the country, and it's always been thus, and that's what has to change. And if unfortunately, if you do try and change that, they bring in the enforcement arm of the racket of the U.S. empire, which is the CIA, NSA. US military, special forces, whatever it is, these are presented as like it's called the Department of Defense, which is a sick joke. It's the Department of Capitalism. Effectively, it's the enforcement arm of capitalism, and it's also a massive transfer of wealth from the poor in America to the rich, because if you've got $1 trillion going into the Pentagon, that's coming from US taxpayers and going to weapons companies. So yeah, it's ugly, but I think to be honest with you, working at the FT and just reading and the newspaper, like I think we probably have the same perspective on this stuff. It's not that complicated. It makes sense. It's not that complicated. If you have the imperial elite, there's a Parenti quote I like, actually. You mentioned him. Where, because if you one of the ways they try and stop people even speaking about this kind of systematic analysis is to say, oh, you're a conspiracy theorist. Parenti says, well, why when teachers get together in a teaching union to get better wages for themselves, that's not a conspiracy theory that they're in that union to get better wages for themselves. Why, when you start applying that same principle to the 1%, that maybe they do strategize about how they're going to enrich themselves even more, how they're going to use the global resources to enrich themselves. Why is that applying agency to the 1% is called a conspiracy theory? When of course they're strategizing all the time, and in fact they've erected a whole infrastructure across the world to make it happen. So more and more people are becoming aware of it, and it is very, very simple. It's just an exploit. It is a racket. It's a way of It's a criminal system that filters and purloins wealth from the global south, repatriates it to Britain, to America, to Europe, and leaves nothing in that country. Unfortunately, the main problem, I think, is just propaganda. It's so hard to get these truths out in the mass media, basically impossible. As I said, I mentioned the propaganda around corporations and why you have to have a corporation doing it. A foreign corporation doing it. Basically, there's no one within the mainstream media that's arguing against that. And also, of course, the mainstream media, most of it is owned by corporations themselves. So you're not like a critical analysis of the corporate system from within the corporate media. But we have to basically, I think that there's two things. We have to dispel the propaganda, and we have to support leaders who are on the front line and actually fighting back against it. Because the other thing is, there's a huge propaganda infrastructure to demonize anyone who starts stepping on the toes of this system. And obviously, no country's perfect, no government's perfect. There's always things to criticize, but what they do is they blow up these things, these criticisms, and then they say to people on the left, well, don't you denounce that? Don't you denounce that? And then you're in this position where you're like basically pushed to the margins and called an apologist for XY regime if you don't, you know what I mean? It's that's very powerful. But we've got to be braver, because at the end of the day, these people are risking their lives a lot of the time, and so we're risking our reputations and our jobs probably. But well, you only live once, you know.
And that kind of brings us to the next, topic of discussion is, I've heard you on many occasions, not one, call out journalists, whether it's the interview that I've watched over 20 times. I can say where you call out a former IOF, I believe his name's Elon Perry. You call him out. Essentially, everything that was coming out of that man's mouth was a lie. And we have a very big problem in people using the term journalism and applying it to lies, to falsified statements, to falsified ideology. So if you could speak to, I've heard, you say, for one, that, what I've gotten from it is that Indigenous people need to take back their narratives. One, they need to take back speaking about the atrocities in a way that certain journalists like to talk about it, but don't highlight it in a way that highlights the Indigenous population being detrimentally exploited by corporations, by Western imperialism. If you could, for an individual like myself, this is kind of like a personal question. What's a game plan for not necessarily for me to navigate, but like how do you not get so frustrated with having to, one, debunk this stuff, but then sitting right across from someone who was essentially an IOF soldier? He was a mercenary. Like how do you keep that composure knowing all of this?
Yeah, well, I think firstly, you have to work outside the system. I mean, in terms of the Indigenous media, Black media, minority media, there are minorities in the FT, for example. But how the system works is, if it tolerates you, it only tolerates you to the extent that it wants to pull you in. There was a guy called Herbert Marcuse who came up with this term, repressive tolerance, where the capitalist system will and its propaganda system will absorb you, but only if you accept the coordinates of control and coordinates of power that they set down. So I think that it very much, like, I'm quite specific about it. I think we have to build up alternative infrastructure on the side. We can't. There's this whole debate of, do you go on the inside and try and influence it from the inside? And that's quite seductive. But also, I believe part of the reason that many people support that is because it's nice to tell yourself you're doing it for a good reason if you're accepting the job at the Guardian or the FT. But in fact, if you look at the proof, and the proof is in the pudding, how many people spend years, decades in those institutions and maintain their integrity and maintain their critical analysis of society? It's basically zero. So what we need to do is build up alternative media. What you're doing, what we did at Declassified, what I want to do in the future is just create an information system where truth is not tainted by corporate and state power, because people need to understand that truth exists, obviously, and empirical evidence exists, but as soon as it enters our society, it's buffeted by state and corporate power. And that's the antithesis of journalism, right? Journalism should be about fearlessly, without fear or favor, and without any interest in mind, analyzing what the truth is. But we don't have that. And to go to your point about the role of journalism, we don't have journalists. We don't have a media. We have a propaganda system, and we have propagandists, to be very honest with you. And I think that's how we need to reformulate the idea. And the system has to be like that to operate. And if it starts getting out of control and people take the role of journalism too seriously and they're in the mainstream, then what happens is someone like Julian Assange, who exposed this whole system that we're talking about on a level that had not been exposed ever, basically. And he spent 5 years in maximum security prison in London for exposing war crimes and for exposing the mechanics of empire. So I think that we need to maintain our integrity by not working with the media, and also have a absolutist idea about the structure we need to create to maintain that integrity. So when we started Declassified, this is one example. We said early on, we won't ever cooperate or collaborate with the mainstream media, any mainstream media. Now, that put an obstacle in place for us in terms of our outreach, because one of the quickest ways you can get outreach if you're starting a new media organization is to ally with the Guardian or whatever, and you instantly reach millions of people with your stories. But what we said was that is exactly how they get you, and they might not even say in a contract where they say, well, you have to do this, you have to do that. It might be hands off, but eventually that infrastructure, that control, that the culture you will absorb it. So we have to see the mainstream media as an arm of the system and its propaganda organ, and build up and also see it not as media and not as journalism. And we need to build up a truly independent media, which is happening. You know, luckily we've been liberated by the internet. I know like Twitter and Facebook and Instagram get a lot of criticism, some of it valid. You know, it's worrying that all our freedom is to disseminate our information relies on these Silicon Valley oligarchs. But the reality is, it has changed the game. Like we couldn't exist without the internet. You guys couldn't exist without the internet. 20 years ago, the control of the legacy media was so strong, and you're going to obviously see government repression to try and equalize that and try and get back their power, but it's going to be harder and harder, and we have to take advantage of it. And also we need to develop funding models because I'm talking about developing an alternative infrastructure.
You're completely talking about transforming the way that we speak about atrocities, it's completely detached from a financial or corporate entity, and so that's something that's always been prevalent. I've been following you for quite some time, and you've been speaking about this in very large forms. And I want to ask, because you do say not working with mainstream media. One of the episodes that I have, I watch you a lot. I'll just say that I'll say I watch you a lot.
For you.
I said poor you. One of my favorite clips is you on unfortunately you on Piers Morgan. Would you how do you classify one what Piers Morgan does, but secondly the attachments that he has? Because for one, Loki did great work with exposing the fact that the person who signs his check just so happens to be Rupert Murdoch, and also happens to be the same individual that is on a list of personal allies, people who Netanyahu trusts. So if you could speak to that, because that kind of rubs into this this final conversation in regards to Gaza, Cyprus, and all of that.
Yeah. Well, it's a very good question, and I'll be honest with you. Number one, because of the seriousness of what's happening in Gaza, I accepted every single interview for about 6 months now. I don't say no to anything and it's good actually, because I've got out there and it's made me realize I don't dislike it as much as I thought I did. But so that's number one. I think that we're in unprecedented. These conversations with yourself, of course, people like you that are on the same page, but like with the Piers Morgan thing, for example, I wouldn't normally do, but I was like, well, I'm going to reach a lot more people with a message that needs to be heard now because the situation is so serious. But so that's number one. Number two, the Piers Morgan show is a pretty disgusting model, to be totally honest. And I felt a bit unclean after that, because I didn't actually expect it to be so rancorous. I thought it would we could have there was a possibility of debate. Obviously that was a bit naive, but I do find it pretty disgusting to make a blood sport out of something so serious as genocide, and it's all set up for clicks. So I don't know if I'd do it again. I mean, but on the other side, you reach millions of people like with his stuff. But then, what are you reaching them with? That's the more important question. You're reaching them with just this kind of shouting, and it's quite hard to. That's what basically my mistake with that was. I went thinking there was going to be a debate, whereas next time I'd have like 5 lines just and repeat them, like, and just while people shout at me just to try and get the point across. But Piers Morgan is he's quite unique. Because of his model, he doesn't do it because he believes in anything, but he does it because it gets clicks and gets money.
Yeah.
But that model that he's worked out gets him clicks and money is one that does allow voices that are just completely locked out of mainstream media. There's like Loki's another good example. Loki is a friend and he's brilliant. He's probably like the most powerful voice we have in Britain for justice and for peace and everything we're all working towards. But he's never invited on the BBC. He's never invited on any mainstream media, but he is invited on Piers Morgan. And what he did, exposing what you said about Rupert Murdoch and Netanyahu and stuff, was extremely powerful. So, but the conversation he had with Loki was a one-on-one, which is a much like when you have 4 people. I didn't even know what it was going to be before when I didn't know it was going to be Alan Dershowitz.
Oh, that's so unprofessional. That is so unprofessional.
I don't know if I do it, but it's an open question. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. I don't know. I don't know. Is this thing of reaching more people, or is it disgusting just the model?
No, I completely agree with you on both sides of that. You know, I'll just say this right now. One of this will be clipped because this is a conversation that I have been having with a multitude of people as well. On the is it important? Is it not important? Is it vital? Is it not vital? And so, you know, just you kind of giving like a background into how that show operates. It's very much so, yes, a blood sport, especially with I mean, 3-on-2 scenarios, and you know, it's like I'm watching in 4K, you know, what Romans were watching during, you know, the Colosseum. And you know, I've asked myself, you know, if I ever got the chance to go on, would I do it? And I'm kind of wishy-washy on it because, again, it's like in one area I feel like I'm disrespecting my Palestinian brothers and sisters, you know, but on the other hand, I'm like, well, they need that exposure and they need someone to be, you know, outspoken for them in a midst where no Wi-Fi, no water, no hot, no nothing, you know. And so I agree with you. You know,
my Palestinian friends were like, they wanted me to do it. That was partly another reason why I did it, and they thought it was powerful to do it because I tried to not allow it to become a blood sport, although it wasn't possible with Alan Dershowitz because he's a lunatic. But I didn't play the game like of just shouting. I responded when I had to, when he was misrepresenting me and stuff. But yeah, it's a difficult one. But I do find it quite interesting that he's allowed to ask people like me, like and Loki and others. There's no other space, and I don't know if you call it mainstream media, but you probably would because of the amount of people he reaches. There's not a single other mainstream media outlet that would allow it. And in fact, what's quite interesting is when I lived in the States, I used to prefer watching Fox News to MSNBC or CNN, just because on MSNBC and CNN it was literally like just watching the congealed ideology of the deep state, you know. And although Fox News was disgusting and racist and all the rest of it, they did allow a wider variety. And now every now and then you would get someone who was speaking outside of that State Department congealed ideology, whether they're on the right or the left. But I don't know. I just found it more. I could watch it without my brain like switching off, which is what happened with MSNBC and CNN. So that's quite interesting and quite scary because the other thing is there's obviously all the things that I talked about the liberation of the media that has been allowed by the internet. That's also liberated the far right as well and the right wing. Like, and you see, I mean, I don't know if you followed what's been happening here, but we had these like fascist riots.
Yeah,
really unprecedented stuff not that long ago. with Muslim mosques being burned, and really all supported by Elon Musk, by the way, or like not supported. Well, it probably was supported, but he was like inflaming it. But there's a far right figure called Tommy Robinson who's now in prison that Elon Musk is basically supporting, and he reinstated him on Twitter. This is another open question, which I'll be interested in your thoughts, because mine are still kind of haven't been formed yet. Because this guy Tommy Robinson he's a real poison in our society, and mainly against Muslims, but he obviously wouldn't stop there. He's on the far right, but he was taken off Twitter by the previous administration, and that goes to the heart of free speech. Do we agree with free speech for people we don't even agree, for people we really disagree with? You'd hope you would, but then, and I'm not agreeing he should be allowed to put up criminal stuff. But even when he was taken off, he basically disappeared. Like, you barely heard from him. Like, he as a figure in our society, he disappeared. Elon Musk buys Twitter, reinstates him, and he's instantly becoming this mainstream figure again, and people are talking about him. He's inciting a riot. So what's the answer to that? Because if we then say, well, they should ban those people, then they're going to use that against us eventually on the left. So that's another open question for me. I mean, to be honest with you, go on.
No, I would say, my apologies for interrupting you as well.
I want to hear on it.
I would say, I mean, from a decolonial perspective, we have to draw the line between free speech and complete bullshit and banter, or hate speech. There's a difference between free speech and hate speech. So I'll use that as a more, a more dialectical term. I think we're not there yet as a group of people. Is that we think that calling someone out of their name is free speech. No, that's hate speech. And that also goes to the lack of intellectualism that plays heavy on sites like Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. We have, at the same time that we have a mode of resistance, we have a mode of anti-intellectualism as well, that it's a clash against each other. And so I always go to, if the person is one, fascist, right wing, hates Muslims, hates Arabs, hates, the African diaspora, hates Ashkenazi Jews, hates Jews in perspective, aligns with Zionism, all of these things, then they shouldn't have a voice. I think that we should take back as the people, being that social media is so powerful, that if they're spewing this type of rhetoric that we know has histories upon decades of oppression and comes with that, then I mean, it's it's like asking me what's 1 + 1. It's 2. I think we know the answer to it, and so, and it's also something that I wrestle with as well, because, like how you said, it can be used against us, but that only comes if we allow this corporate imperialist system to still fester. And so I think what we're seeing now is through your work at Declassified, through the books that you have, produced, and a multitude of other people, we are seeing that resistance on a media perspective. We are seeing people be silenced completely. And I can even say that, Piers Morgan is a tool of silence. He also, in most cases, like he's brung on Kevin Spacey, he's brung on all of these people that, were silenced, or that were, but they were silenced for what? They were silenced for being grotesque. They were silenced for, and so I think, we have a co-optation of wokeness. We have co-optation of all of these terms that they now use to try and justify their indiscriminate, genocides, their indiscriminate racism. And so I hope that answered, because again, I wrestle with it, but I've always,
I was going to add actually that which is important to come up with solutions, because we need to talk about a vision of how we can change things rather than just what's wrong with it. Like, in terms of the infrastructure of building an alternative media, when you have the power of corporations and the states, that they're the same thing. I think that's another thing people need to understand, the conceptual idea that they're adversarial bodies. In a lot of the states just working for the corporation has been completely co-opted. But anyway, when you have those kind of power centers where it's just overwhelming power. You have to, if you have an independent media or alternative media that's fighting back against that, and it's just disparate and unorganized and doesn't have any kind of strategic infrastructure in place, then they can destroy you. But the only power center that can really go up against that is the power of organized labor. And what I believe needs to happen is that trade unions need to start investing money in media. We need worker-owned, worker-funded media, because that's the only way we're going to really create institutions that really have the power to take on the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, Fox News, whatever it is, because they got all the money and the resources. Whereas but so do the workers. There's millions of pounds and millions of dollars within these institutions that they, like, for example, just on the UK side, the unions here pay millions every year so workers' money goes to the Labour Party, which is absurd. This is an anti-worker sort of arch-capitalist party that has been overseeing the genocide in Gaza recently, but has also done many, many other awful things in its existence. If we could unleash those funds, say, stop funding the Labour Party, stop funding this reactionary institution, which is working against your members, and fund media, we could change the game overnight. I really believe that. If you had 10 million pounds, for example, which is, I think, that's a low ball for what the unions give the Labour Party. 10 million pounds, we could build like proper institutions. We could have hundreds of reporters working on newspapers, on TV. That could change the game. And so I think we need to put pressure on unions to do that, because the other point about unions is, because they're so important, and so in terms of resistance to this system, they've been co-opted a lot of the time. So you see the leaders are just, they look like the Labour Party politicians, or they look like the corporate executive even. We need to get like revolutionaries and workers, like proper workers. They used to have that in the UK, by the way, in the 60s and 70s. It was kind of smashed by Margaret Thatcher. But in the 60s and 70s, there were real firebrand union leaders. The miners' strike, which was famous in the 80s, that Margaret Thatcher smashed, was led by Arthur Scargill, who was like a communist. And we need that back, because that's the way we're going to affect real change.
Yeah, and a book, I don't know if you're aware or if you're familiar with the name Armed Struggle by Gerald Horne, goes through a historical analysis of the armed struggle and how, I mean, just sorry to say it, but I mean, it is true how these unions have been taken over by corporations, by corporate media, and have funneled these false narratives, manufactured consent, just to kind of keep it, to what a simple term. Within that book, it also highlights, I'm not too sure if you know about like the Black Bolshevik, Harry Haywood, who, again, like, this is all stuff that's lacking within the labor parties, on not just, on both sides of the pond. We as a group of people haven't really scratched the surface of that yet. And I always classify it as that we have some organizations that are out there saying that you can be a revolutionary, but only from the hours of 4 to 7 because we got to go back to work. That type of model has to change. I think if we're shutting down imperialism, that means we do not show up for work, and we make it that no one else can show up for work. So if you're living in, I speak in radical, and I have a radical tongue. I'll just say it. I want less, spray paint and fire extinguishers, and more of, people reading guerrilla warfare to how to create, things of resistance. If you picking up what I'm putting down, I think we're just not there yet. And I think what you're classifying is like, yes, if we were to implement, the funding where it should go, in regards to, taking back the narratives, we put ourselves in a completely different position to be able to take back the truth, and actually, spread it. So.
Yeah, and we need to be more radical. That's basically the bottom line. The system that I've described they're all part of it, even unions. this is an ecosystem which has been designed, or at least has taken form in the interests of the oligarchy in different places. And if they don't apply that, they get smashed. So that's how it works. And it's quite interesting in Latin America, which we've been talking about. Like, if you look at the liberation leaders there, all of them got into power pretty much by starting their own parties, because they knew that the liberal left oligarchical parties were set up to stop them getting into power. They're there to give the impression of democracy, but they're effectively an arm of the oligarchy, which is the same with the Labour Party here. But there's a self-reinforcing mechanism with it, because that if you want to work within a system, and most people at some stage decide they want to, whether consciously or not, because they want a normal life, they want to they have a mortgage, they got kids, blah blah blah. It's quite hard to maintain that radical perspective, and that's how the system gets you. There's a famous quote, I can't remember who it was, it Jack London or someone. He said, anyway, the line goes, "It's very hard to make someone understand something when their wage depends on them not understanding it." And I think that explains so much about the system. Like, people aren't consciously thinking, I'm changing my opinion because I want to keep my job, but that basically that premise operates on a subconscious level the whole time, and people just do not want to risk everything because they have a really strongly held belief. And as I said, like the FT, if I didn't go in with a really strong idea of how the world worked, I would have I felt the pressure even within that. Like, it's intense, and so we got to be more radical and understand that you can't be radical within the system, because the system doesn't allow radicalism. So it's got to be outside the system. And like you said, you're a radical. Like, we have to think up different. We have to have an open mind to what will work. Every situation is different. You know, within the Latin American context, they could do it within the democratic, even the sort of limited democratic forms they had, like Evo Morales and Chavez and stuff. In Africa, it's probably a bit harder to do that, and it's got I think the liberation leaders have got him through a coup. But I think every situation is different, isn't it? Like, we have to evaluate what is going to affect change. But the one thing that is quite obvious is the system is falling apart right now, and it's finding it very, very hard to maintain the ideologies and the myths that justify it within the context of what we're seeing all around us. And Trump's a good example of that. Although obviously he's not of our political thinking, he is outside the Washington consensus in terms of he talks about against globalists. Obviously he's not for the working man and woman in America, but that the reason that rhetoric that he uses, anti-establishment against globalism, works is because people know the system is effing them over, and they want something different, and they're not being offered it properly by the left, or at least the left's got a more convoluted explanation, whereas Trump's is very, very clear. It says, it's all about Mexicans on the border, it's all about Muslims, it's all about they find them in minorities. That's why I really feel like now we have a historic responsibility as the left to step up, because if we don't, we're going to see some really dark shit happening. I mean, really dark. I'm reading a book now which is called The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich by an American journalist who actually lived during the 30s in Nazi Germany. So he saw it all firsthand, and it's quite terrifying reading it, actually, because obviously we haven't got a Hitler figure, but the conditions that he describes and the sort of feeling on the street is not that dissimilar to what we're seeing now. So all it takes is a Trump type. I mean, he's not Hitler, but you know what I mean? He wouldn't have been anywhere near power in a different time, but the conditions are right for demagogues who use minorities. In Hitler's case, it was the Jews, but in Trump's case, it's immigrants, illegal immigrants, what he calls illegal immigrants, Mexicans, Muslims. And we're going to go further and further and further down that path until the left actually steps up. And the other thing, sorry, I'll just finish with this about that book, is it quite clearly shows that there was nothing inevitable about the Nazi takeover of Germany. Like, there were huge mistakes made principally by the left. inter rivalries, and he could have been stopped. It's quite clear there was a lot of errors made. So again, it heightens the historic responsibility we have to get this right, to make sure we should have made sure Trump didn't happen, but to make sure something worse than Trump doesn't even happen afterwards.
If only he wouldn't have turned his head.
You're not allowed to say that.
No, I completely agree with you. And, this leads us to, your work at Declassified, and how important that is to exposing and putting out there the truthful narratives that aren't being told by mainstream media, as me and you both know. I want to just for a quick plug-in for those that are watching. This is a pre-recorded conversation. I'm sitting down with Matt Kennard, the co-founder of Declassified, author of the Racket and another book which I'll be getting my hands on pretty soon. And we've been having a conversation about the complicities of imperialism within journalism, within how corporations have essentially destroyed the world with the help of the U.S. military industrial complex along with that. And so that brings us to the conversation around Gaza, around Cyprus, around West Asia. But before we get to that, I want to say like, share, subscribe. And this is donation-based media. So if you see the little ticker below, then you can help out. We were demonetized. We were defunded. And so we're trying to, in every way possible, get the resources that it's needed for us to continue our work over here, exposing the complicities of Zionism within sports and a multitude of other things as well. But Matt, getting back to Gaza, or to our conversation, let's talk about Gaza. Let's talk about your work there in the West Bank and Palestine, to be exact, to be correct. Just tell us about your time there and the sheer extermination at this point of indigenous people in a land that me and you both know is being occupied.
Yeah, so I went there. I've been there twice. I went first in 2009, actually not as a journalist. I did do some journalism while I was there, but I went with the International Solidarity Movement, which was I don't know if it still exists actually, but I think it does. But it's a group that was set up to bring internationals to Palestine to help Palestinians in action, non-violent actions against the Israeli military and the Israeli state. So I was there 2009, and one of the major issues, which actually continues to the day, was the Israeli takeover of East Jerusalem. They're basically kicking out the native population, and I stayed in a neighborhood called Sheikh Jarrah, which is in East Jerusalem, and slept on the floor of a family that were being evicted. And it was a profound experience. I mean, it definitely changed me. I wouldn't say in a positive way, because it made me understand how the world works a lot better, and also it made me understand about how systems of oppression work, and it made me understand how systems of oppressions are justified in the Western media. So it was a microcosm of how the whole thing works, because the family I was staying with had been given a house in the 1950s. Soon after the Nakba by the Jordanian government, and lived there for like 60 years. Two parents and 3 kids, and lovely family, and this Israeli settler company were just kicking them out based on some forged Ottoman era contract. And then I went as well while I was there to Bilain and Nilain and Nabi Saleh, which are 3 villages which are being cut up by the apartheid wall, were cut up by the apartheid wall, which is actually an annexation wall, because it colonized a lot of land. And that, again, very extreme experience, because we got shot at by the Israelis just on a non-violent protest, with rubber bullets, but also gas canisters, high velocity gas canisters, which can kill you if they're shot, like, and they're meant to shoot them up in the air, but they shoot them at you. And I remember one went right past my head, and in fact, an American activist was killed by one of those not long after I was there. And they shoot kids in the head, and I mean, it's awful. So it was a very, very important experience in my political development. And I think everyone who goes to Palestine says the same thing, because it's so clear that this is a monstrous system, apartheid, where you have division, walls, oppression, guns. It's a whole infrastructure of violence, which is the Palestinians have lived under ever since the Nakba in 1948, and in fact before as well. So it was very, very important. I mean, and then you come up to the present and you realize that the genocide in Gaza is kind of the logical conclusion of the whole settler colonial project of the Zionists in Palestine, because it is in essence a genocidal project. It's definitely an ethnic cleansing project. And I'm sitting in London. You know, it was our fault. We gave Palestine away. It wasn't ours to give away, but we gave it away to the Zionist movement in 1917 with the Balfour Declaration. And the Labour Party were in power in 1948 when the Nakba happened and basically allowed it to happen. And we've been torturing the Palestinians ever since. So the British have a kind of uniquely awful role in all of this. So when the Gaza genocide started, I knew all this and realized that this history of torturing the Palestinian people or the British state was likely continuing, because we've got an extremely Zionist government and media. So I started looking at what was happening on our bases on Cyprus. Now, again, this is another insight into how imperialism never died. You know, I said that whole idea that they were told that the British Empire was decommissioned, America's not an empire.
Turned into a bank. It was.
This is like, Cyprus is my favorite example of this, because they say, well, Cyprus was given independence, but it actually wasn't. It was 3% of the territory was maintained, but was kept by the British, which we still own. One is a huge airbase in the West, and one is a huge intelligence stations. They're both actually joint bases with the United States, not officially, but that's another facet of them, is that they double as American bases. So with knowing that, I was like, well, these bases are a 40-minute flight time from Tel Aviv. I'm sure they're involved in some way. And then I asked the Ministry of Defense about a month in, like I said, how many RAF flights have gone from RAF Akrotiri on Cyprus to Israel since the start of the bombing of Gaza? And they said, can't tell you. And then as a journalist, I'm like, well, if they're not telling me, then I need to find out. And at that point, I'd never used a flight tracker website before, but now I know how to use them like the back of my hand. So I started like exploring these flight tracker websites, and was quite shocked to find out that actually the military flights that were going to Israel from RAF Akrotiri were actually registered on these sites. So I then found how many there were had been sent in like the first month. Went back to the Ministry of Defense and said, I'm going to publish this story. And then they panicked and said, okay, well, we'll tell you how many have gone now. And then I published that first story, and then it escalated from there. I just kept an eye on all those. I kept an eye on the fact that it was leaked to the press that the SAS had deployed to Cyprus for Gaza operations. It was leaked on October 27th in the Sun newspaper, which is a horrific Murdoch right-wing newspaper. But then the 28th, the following day, they sent out a D notice. Now, for American listeners, this is a system where the Ministry of Defense can send out a advisory warning to all media not to publish certain information, and they sent one out about what the SAS in Gaza. And since that day, there's not been any information about what the SAS have been up to in Gaza. So it could be that they were integral to the genocide. In fact, I'd say it was likely they were. In terms of, they usually have, what they do is they have them in an advisory capacity. So they go and advise on a ground operation, for example. But again, it could have been that they were in Gaza. We know nothing about that. Jeremy Corbyn asked a question in Parliament about it, said, have there been any UK personnel on the ground in Gaza? And the Ministry of Defence refused to answer. Then there's and then in December, they officially announced that they were going to start spy flights over Gaza. They didn't say where from, how long they were going to be in the air, or how frequent they were going to be. And then I found out they were going nearly daily from RAF Akrotiri over Gaza, for 5 hours and giving this information to the Israelis. We still don't know to this day what information they were giving to the Israelis, or what departments. So what kind of unraveled was that the UK was a key player in the genocide. And I think that it's a tripartite genocide. You know, the US provides the majority of the weapons, the Brits give the intelligence, and the Israelis get it done. And actually, Al Jazeera did a follow-up bit of work on our work and found that nearly 50% of all reconnaissance flights over Gaza during the genocide were flown by Britain, more than double what Israel itself flew. So it's incredible. And this goes to the heart, even me, before we started Declassified, and I've been disabused of this notion, but even me, I was like, well, the Brits, you know, they're this like 2-bit sort of not important player now, as the United States is the big player in town. But you realize, like, Britain still plays a lot. Obviously, it's a junior partner to the United States, but it still plays an important imperial role. And you see that it went from Libya to Syria to Iraq. You know, there's that the US always brings in the Brits to do different jobs. In Gaza, it was the intelligence, but it also our government is basically captured by Israel in this country, and in fact our legal system now is captured by Israel, which is one of the more horrific parts in terms of the domestic side of things. Has been the repression of British citizens and the dismantling of our democratic rights on behalf of the Netanyahu regime, this far right genocidal regime. You know, there's been journalists getting raided.
Richard Medhurst, one of them.
Medhurst was held for 23 hours at Heathrow Airport in solitary confinement. He's now charged under the Terrorism Act. Asa Winstanley, another brilliant journalist.
And that's under Section 12, correct?
And Asa Winstanley, who's a friend of mine and is a brilliant journalist, he was raided maybe 3 or so months ago, or 2 months ago. His one's actually quite interesting because he wasn't even charged or taken to prison, or he basically had his house raided, all his devices taken, and wasn't charged with a crime. I actually didn't realize they could do that to you in Britain, that they, without charging you with a crime, they can take all your possessions. But that's what happened to him. And then there was another one called Sarah Wilkinson who got raided and bundled into a van, and she was charged.
She's just posting, right? That's the individual who's just posting stuff on Twitter, just getting updates.
Yep, it's crazy. But what it is that there's a whole Zionist ecosystem of trying to get people arrested. Now, after Sarah Wilkinson was arrested, one of their Twitter accounts I saw, they were celebrating and said that finally the Metropolitan Police had taken our advice and taken our constant referrals and charged and arrested Sarah Wilkinson. So obviously there's all these people working, but what the British government, what the British police should do is just dismiss it, but they're not. They're taking it. And in fact, just on Saturday this week, there was this huge, kind of unprecedented police repression of the Palestine March. They arrested Chris Nineham, who's the chief steward of the marches, vice chair of Stop the War Coalition, just a very, very important figure in the anti-war movement here for like 20 years. They arrested him and he was in the cells all night and was released and charged under the Terrorism Act as well. And they even this week questioned John McDonnell and Jeremy Corbyn, who used the shadow leader of the Labour Party and the shadow chancellor from 2015 to 2020. They charged them that they questioned them. The police questioned them under caution. So this is scary stuff. It's all been done on behalf of Israel, and it's because Israel has spent decades now building up an infrastructure of lobbying of our political system, which has allowed it basically to dictate to the government, but also to the police and the penal system, it seems as well, what they can do with British citizens. So this needs to change, obviously, but it has ratcheted up. But to go back to your original question, the British ministers should be charged and taken to The Hague, because they're not just complicit. There's this word that's used; they're participating. And if you're giving intelligence to a power that is bombing people in a genocide, then you are terrorism. Yeah. Well, and you're participating in it, because in providing intelligence. And one of the capabilities of the plane they've been sending over daily over Gaza, it's called an ISTAR vehicle. One of them is target acquisition for military strikes. So, and the Liberal Democrat Lord actually asked in Parliament, Ministry of Defence said, "Are you using the information? Are the Israelis using the information for military targeting?" Simple question, and the Ministry of Defence said, "We can't tell you." So again, we're still scratching the surface, but ministers should be charged. Also, obviously, the US, Biden and Kamala Harris and Anthony Blinken, they should be charged well, because they all know what's going on and they know what their weapons are doing. They can't claim that they didn't know. We all know. So they're participating in one of the worst crimes of recent history, of maybe of all history. So. Yeah, it's changed the world, though, hasn't it? You know, it's like people are awake now. I mean, all the stuff we're talking about, the colonialism, the
I'm hearing those words more than I've ever heard in my life.
People, partly the way they get away with it is because it's quite hard to visualize it. Like, we can tell you, like, the reason Africa's poor is because the imperial powers have siphoned their resources off through and installed client leaders for 500 years, and in Latin America the same. But people can't visualize it or can't feel an emotional connection with that. Whereas if you're watching kids getting blown up every day, and mass starvation campaigns, and then you're watching your leaders who have been telling you they're spreading all these wonderful things, get up and defend it and send more weapons and stuff, I think that contradiction has a much more visceral effect and has changed a lot of people. I talk at a lot of things now, like publicly, and people come up to me after and say, like, I spent 50 years reading the old grannies will say, I spent 50 years reading the Daily Telegraph, which is a right-wing paper here. I had no idea of anything or about how the world works, really. But Gaza has completely transformed my view of the world, and they start questioning everything. So we have a responsibility to use that awakening to push forward to liberate the minds of the masses, not just about Gaza, but about the whole imperial system, because it won't end in Gaza. You know, Gaza's like maybe the whole is just this little strip of land where these three nuclear armed powers are just concentrating their whole imperial system of violence. So it's very, very clear. But this system of violence, it's never stayed in one place. They're going to go for Venezuela, Cuba, maybe Africa. That, you know, that it's a rapacious system that does not take a victory and then just pack up shop. It moves on to the next target.
Yeah, no, it's very oddly reminiscent to cancer. Is if you don't attack it at the root, if you don't attack it when you first see it, then it spreads to wherever it could get its hands on. And I want to, you know, there's one thing that you did uncover too, is that it's not just aerial support that the UK has been giving to Gaza. It has also been where planes that are essentially could be classified as aircraft carriers, carrying anywhere from tanks to Humvees to ammunition, artillery. Could you speak to that? Like, because it's not just the drones, it's not just the plane, the flights. It's a all out enterprise of war.
Yeah, exactly. Well, you know, I mentioned I saw those flights originally. So when I was looking on the flight tracking websites, I was seeing these huge military transport vehicles going, and these are called C-17s and A400Ms. And as you mentioned, they can carry tanks, Abrams tanks, Chinook helicopters, up to 150 personnel. And they were basically going daily from Cyprus to Israel. And still to this day, we don't know what was on them. I don't believe. The government has said that they were taking medical supplies and moving cabinet ministers. But you're talking about, in the first couple of months, 50 of them. So it's not explained at all. But and they continued. It did settle down by the following summer. But the other side of that is, as I mentioned, that Akrotiri is a US base as well. And actually, it's been known that they've had personnel there for 50 years, but the US and the UK have never revealed what the complexion or the size of that deployment is. And I revealed it for Declassified actually in 2022. It's 129 airmen, the US airmen that are permanently deployed at Akrotiri. And what you saw as well is lots and lots of US Air Force flights going from Akrotiri to Tel Aviv, and they were very, very likely carrying weapons. And then later on, I did a story about, I was noticing these smaller vehicles called CN 295s, which were unmarked. And then I looked at the serial number and found out they were US Air Force. And these are airplanes that are used by the CIA and special forces. And they were going right up to last month. And again, it's very, very interesting that in the British imperial system, one of the major services we provide to the Americans is we open up our bases to them and they can do what they want. Number one. Number two, which is very, very useful to them as well, is they operate as black sites for the Americans. So you cannot get any information. You can get some information. There's transparency mechanisms where we can find information about what the British are doing on their own bases, right? But if you ask any question about what the Americans are doing on their bases, and they have 11 in the UK itself, and as I say, they use Akrotiri as well, you get a blanket answer, which is we don't comment on allies' activities on our bases. So I couldn't get any information about the US Air Force from official channels. I had to do it all through flight tracker websites. But it's highly likely that US Special Forces were being moved, and I think it's fact that the US Air Force was using Akrotiri to move weapons to Israel, because that was reported in Haaretz, actually, the Israeli newspaper. They said 40 US Air Force flights had gone in the first month from Akrotiri to Tel Aviv. So it's a whole infrastructure of support and participation in genocide, which was all being done. The central node for it all was this base in Cyprus. And in fact, interestingly, there was no reaction at all in the mainstream media here, as you might expect. But in Cyprus, it became a huge issue, and the press did report it. And the reporting that we did had caused protests at RAF Akrotiri in Limassol, which is the city right next door. And the president of Cyprus had to make a comment. The president of Northern Cyprus had to make a comment, and it became a huge, huge issue because there's quite a strong pro-Palestinian movement in Cyprus. I didn't know this beforehand, but and it caused a real problem for the British, because the British, one of the things about Akrotiri and Decolonization is they don't want them to be issues. If you go to the north of the island, the Turkish occupation since 1974 is very obnoxious. They have their flags on the hills. Cypriots hate it. It's like a everyday issue. Like it's a real bugbear. Yeah, exactly. But the British, when you go into these territories, and they're not just bases, by the way, because they're huge. It's 3% of the island, so you can drive for 20 minutes across them, and there's people living on them and stuff. But once you enter them, you don't know you're on them because there's no British flags, not one. I didn't see one British flag. So they're trying to keep it very, very low level. But the work we did kind of made that impossible. So, and this is the other thing about the Gaza operation. It really exposed all the different pressure points of the imperial system that they like to keep as secret as possible. Even Decolonization, the intelligence base in the east, that was the best stuff we know about that came from Edward Snowden's leaks in 2013. But one of them, which is quite funny, is that one of the leaks showed that the British were so intent that the Cypriots not know that it was a huge American base that the American spies had to dress up as tourists when they went into work, so that they weren't suspected of having a big CIA and NSA station there, which there is. But again, we're scratching the surface on that as well, because we don't know what that intelligence station was being used to support Israel. But we do know from Edward Snowden as well that the NSA, which runs Decolonization, and the Israeli intelligence community are extremely close. And the quote from the Snowden documents is that they share intelligence daily. So you can imagine those facilities were being used to provide Israel with intelligence for its Gaza operations. So there's a whole story that needs to come out. I think we're scratching the surface, and hopefully, if the legal case expands from Netanyahu and Gallant, we can get these some process of discovery and disclosure legally, which would mean they'd have to reveal a lot of the stuff that we haven't got access to now, because all this is so secret, like the SAS that I mentioned, the GCHQ, NSA, but it's not secret to protect us, it's secret to protect themselves from us, and protect us from the reality of what we're doing, which is participating in a genocide. So and hopefully it will all come out. Who knows though? We need to.
I think you're one. For those that aren't aware, Declassified UK, along with, I could throw in there, Electronic Intifada, has been the pillar for a lot of, you know, decolonial journalists like myself, broadcast journalists. We heavily rely on you know, your guys' analysis and what you guys bring to the table. And so for my viewers, I'm hoping that, you know, you guys could, you know, if aren't already tuned in, please go and support, because it helps. And this is what Matt was talking about and alluded to earlier in this conversation. This is that we have to take back media, and the way that comes at is, you know, we're going to need a little help. You know, unfortunately, we live under capitalism, and so finances plays a huge role in us being able to tackle these atrocities. And again, thank you for you know, talking about, you know, this is you're just scratching the surface of the issue. Is that right now we can just speculate that, you know, or come up with a mild speculation, but that wouldn't be rooted in professionalism. We have to, you know, we can speculate that yes, they probably were sending ammunition, they probably were sending artillery, tanks, Humvees, whatever was needed in order for them to enact the occupation and atrocities onto Gaza. But you also highlight too is that as journalists we have to play the patient game, unfortunately, in order for us to get the truth out, which is what I'm doing right now. I put in a request to the National Basketball Players Association because we have a Zionist playing for the Portland Trail Blazers. His name is Deji Ajdava, and he promotes Zionism. He does it all over his page. They allow him to do it, but I'm pointing out the double standard, and I have in an article that I submitted on Substack that highlights the double standards within the NBA and how they are complicit in this genocide as well. There's no organization or institution within the United States Imperial Core that is not complicit in this genocide, and so it is a major focal point of mine. I went to Dan Patrick's School of Sports Broadcasting. Went through some very racist things there, seeing how they wanted, you know, us to talk about certain narratives in regards to, you know, the African diaspora. And so I have my understanding of like how sports media works tangibly with, you know, news media, political news media to, you know, debuckle, silence Palestinian resistance, African resistance, liberations. And so I've had to play the silent game. I've had to play the patient game so that I can get the information out there. But what I was, you know, able to uncover is that, you know, they reprimanded Dwight Howard while allowing him to play. So it's, you know, it's not even just sports plays a huge role is basically what I'm trying to allude to. In the work that you guys do, again, it helps me get to those, you know, those basics of understanding. So I just want to say thank you to that. I wanted to, in the last little 10 minutes, if we do have time, I don't know too sure how much time you have.
Maybe one more.
You said probably one more question. Okay. You know, you didn't just jump into this. You come from, you know, your father was politically outspoken. If you can speak to, you know, your father's history, what he's done for, you know, as a political artist, and how that ties into, you know, taking back the narrative as well, is that it's not just media, it's also artistry, it's also every aspect of society needs to be taken back.
Yeah, well, like you say, like media is one example of the co-option of an industry by corporate state power, but it happens across the board. Any industry that has some impact on popular perception of society is there's an effort to co-opt it and make sure it's working for the narratives of the state and the corporations. And art may be the most extreme version of that, to be honest with you. If you look at the state of the art world, like there's so few political artists now. There's so few artists speaking out about Gaza, for example. Even, and this goes for musicians as well. It's out. If you look at the Vietnam War, there was a lot of prominent figures from the culture industries taking a stand against what the Americans were doing. But in Gaza, it's been few and far between. You know, there's some noble exceptions, but it's but I think what it is an expression of is that the co-option of our information system, our culture by corporations and by the state has actually ramped up and got worse in the last 20, 30 years, particularly since the end of the Cold War, because they've just had it's been unfettered, their ability to just infest every part of our society. So in the case of my dad, he's always been a marginal figure, really, when he shouldn't have, because he was politicized by the war in Vietnam. He was in the UK at the time, but obviously there was a big protest movement here against the war in Vietnam, and he started making images against the war and against the state, the repression in America. Because remember the Kent State killings. He made a whole series about that, and then he moved into what he kind of became famous for was photo montage, which is this way of methodology in art where you just cut up different images and to create a third meaning. It's quite a political dialectical process, even in the sort of method itself. And there's some one of the most famous sort of precedents for that is John Hartfield, who not many people will know, but he was someone who was working in Nazi Germany and doing photo montages against the rise of the Nazis. There was a famous one where there's a picture of Adolf Hitler going doing a Nazi salute, and then there's a businessman behind him putting money in his hand. So the idea being that the Nazis' rise was funded by big business, which was true. But that's the kind of, so he started doing that, and if you listen to what he says, again it goes to what we've been talking about. He said that in the 70s and 80s there was a really vibrant alternative press, and nearly all the work he was doing was for like small lefty newspapers and trade unions and stuff like that. There was a very, very vibrant ecosystem which doesn't exist now. We have it online, but we don't have anything similarly. And even online, doesn't have the same sort of structure. So a lot of his work, and then he started publishing them in The Guardian, which then was a bit more radical, or much more radical than it is now. And then what he did was kind of what we should do as journalists. You know, it's about cutting up the images that we accept as reality, and cutting them up with something else to show the true meaning of those images. So a politician at a lectern pontificating about democracy and human rights, and then you can put like the victims of his wars in front of him, just lying down, just put them in. It's powerful. And he was also working on the streets. He was putting up stuff on the streets, and a lot of his work was about problematizing images that we see as just like archetypal English images. So, for example, Constable by Haywain, which is a very, very famous image of the countryside. It's kind of seen as the bucolic, like fairy tale of Britain. This image is very, very famous. It's just like a haywain in a pond of trees. And what he did is at the time they were going to deploy American nuclear weapons in Britain, and they were driving them through the streets or whatever. And so he put bombs on the haywain itself, and basically he did a lot of work like that, like ripping up images that we accepted, like of the Queen or something like that. And then a lot of that work really inspired Banksy, because like Banksy's idea of like he'll get an old photo and then he'll put a modern police line across it. That comes from my dad's work. That idea of So he knows Banksy, and also I think inspired a whole generation of street artists who were doing political stuff, which they're doing in Britain and stuff. But he's not as well known as he should. He's never been let into the art world, which is not a surprise, I guess. But he just had a show actually at the Whitechapel Gallery, which is in London, and that was his first show, I think, ever at like a proper mainstream gallery. And he's in his 70s now. So, but that's what you get if you start doing stuff critical of the corporations and of the state's wars. But it does show also that art has the power to change the narrative in the same way that we're talking about the media does. Like, it inspires people to think, and in a way that maybe even like an article can't. Like, an image can hit someone very fast, and if it's totally debunks something they've been propagandized with, then it can be quite powerful. And he says that people do come up to him and say, I saw that image 20 years ago and it started me thinking, and started me thinking along more critical lines, and it opened up a whole world for me. So it's quite powerful in that sense, which is why if you look at like the corporate world, they try so hard to squeeze out any kind of political content from any of the artists that they promote. And even Ai Weiwei, I'll finish with this. Ai Weiwei is a very good example, the famous Chinese artist who's great. But he was like the darling of the Western media when he was being persecuted by the Chinese for his art. And then he came here and he started speaking about in favor of Julian Assange. And then he started speaking about Gaza, and he was just like disappeared by the media because he was no longer useful to the narrative of the state.
He was propagating lies.
Exactly. And it was very, very. I was watching it in real time with Ai Weiwei, which you can't usually do. It happens in a much more sort of low level, sort of insidious way. But with him, it was like one day he was like the talk of the town, and then the next day, no, you can't. You'll never hear about him. So it's powerful. And there are more. I think the younger generation are doing much more interesting and political work than the older generation. And also street art, graffiti and stuff. It's in its nature because it's out on the street and it's for the people. It's not in this kind of behind a wall in a gallery. It's got a much more communal and socialistic feeling to it. So that's hopeful.
Yeah, and I bring up your father not because I've seen in other episodes people bring him up just for clickbait. I bring him up because I actually did AP studio art, and I actually learned, and I'm very outspoken from from that perspective. I can't say I picked up a paintbrush or a pencil in well over 5 years. But I can say right now, you going through the motions of like creating new things. I was like, yep, let me take some mental notice. I got a free canvas open literally right there. I want to say.
Have you heard of Dred Scott, the artist?
Yeah, I was gonna say I that's arguably one of my favorite interviews that you've done on Apolitical.
Oh yeah.
Because he talks about the radicalization of artistry, and how he got to one, calling himself Dred Scott. For those that don't know, he isn't the original Dred Scott, but is pays homage to the original. But yeah, arguably one of my favorite interviews that you've done, along with you putting Elon Perry in his place. I'll just say that. Again, like I said, I enjoy your work. I enjoy everything that you do on Declassified, Apolitical. You've been on a multitude of other networks as well, and I know I'm missing a few, quite a few. I wasn't able to ask you some questions, but I will say this next time I will have some questions about the Ninja Turtles. I do know you're a fan. But for those that don't know, this is Matt Kennard. He is the co-founder of Declassified UK, the author of the Racket. There's another question. Masters of the Universe. Is that that's not a He-Man connection, is it? Or did you just throw that in there?
You got an old edition of the book, because the book,
okay. I have an older edition then.
Is a Rogue Reporter vs the American Empire.
Okay, so I have an older edition. Okay,
Master of the Universe, I think it comes from Adam Smith, I think, that the economist,
Okay.
the classical liberal economist from many centuries ago, but he called the capitalist class the masters of the world, I think.
Oh, okay. No, I'm a big '80s nerd when it comes to cartoons. So I thought it was like I thought it was just a He-Man reference. Like, so my bad. Nonetheless, so this is Matt Kennard. My name is Isaac Jasper, and this was the first episode of Decolonizing Media, a 10 media production that will be aired on Black Power Media Reloaded and on this network as well. Again, thank you, Matt. Hopefully, I can have you on again. It was a blast.
Yeah, great to meet you. All right, take care. Bye.
All right, bye-bye. All right, everybody. So that was Matt Kennard. You guys will see me in the next episode. Stay tuned. I hope you guys enjoyed. Below is a way you can help out, like, share, subscribe, donate if you can. This is donation-based media. We are in need of help. So by any means necessary, as Malcolm X would classify. That was a really good conversation. So again, I hope you guys enjoyed it. We will see you guys in the next one.